On behalf of the Jesuit School Network's conference office, welcome to our latest virtual inquiry session. As you know, the JSN seeks to be a supportive resource to our member schools, and this virtual session is designed to be just that, a carved out space to listen, to learn, and to engage. We're eager to encourage a spirit of inquiry across the many layers of our work in Jesuit education, and we envision our particular brand of educational inquiry at the JSN to be the art of inquiry as seen through our Ignatian lens, asking questions and exploring issues that matter in our schools through the frame of our shared Jesuit mission. I am Kristin Cully, Director of Educational Inquiry with the JSN Conference Office, and I'd like to thank my colleague, Kristin Smith, who leads all things communications for the JSN, who is here on the call with us as well, and will help us to enjoy a smooth session together. Why don't we take a moment to begin, as we always do, with a prayer? If we can quiet ourselves in the middle of our day here at various points across the different time zones of the network. If we can take a moment to quiet ourselves and to be reminded that in being together this afternoon that we are in the presence of God. So in the name of the Father and Son and Holy Spirit. And I'd like to start our session today to begin with a blessing for listening. In this century and in any century, our deepest hope, our most tender prayer is that we learn to listen. May we listen to one another in openness and mercy. May we listen to plants and animals in wonder and respect. May we listen to our own hearts in love and forgiveness. May we listen to God in quietness and awe. And in this listening, which is boundless in its beauty, may we find the wisdom to cooperate with a healing spirit, a divine spirit, who beckons us into peace and community and creativity. We do not ask for a perfect world, but we do ask for a better world. We ask for deep listening. In these days of challenge in our world, we pray especially for the grace of listening to one another, of hope, of coming together, and for our desire to be welcoming communities in this Easter season. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, St. Ignatius, pray for us. Again, I welcome you to our latest virtual inquiry session entitled Being the Head Teacher, Exploring Jesuit High School Principals' Promotion of Student-Centered Learning. This inquiry session will examine the recent doctoral research of Dr. Russ Fiorella, a theology teacher and instructional leader at Jesuit High School in Portland, Oregon. His study explores the lived experience of Jesuit high school principals promoting student-centered learning within an Ignatian paradigm. The purpose of the study was to learn what student-centered learning means in Jesuit high school classrooms, how principals educate their faculty for student-centered instruction, and the challenges they face in this critical dimension of their leadership. It's my great pleasure to formally introduce our leader, our speaker here, who will guide us this afternoon. Russ Fiorella, EDD, attended Canisius High School and Canisius University in Buffalo, New York, and has since taught for a decade in Jesuit schools, including for 5 years at St. Peter's Preparatory School in Jersey City, New Jersey. He holds an MA in Theology and Pastoral Ministry from Boston College, and certificates in project-based learning and instructional leadership from the University of Pennsylvania and Harvard University, respectively. Russ currently teaches theology at Jesuit High School in Portland, Oregon. Recently, Russ completed a doctorate in educational leadership at Gonzaga University in Spokane, Washington, and his research and writing interests include purpose and its development in adolescence, professional learning, leadership, and the Ignatian pedagogical paradigm. One of the things Russ has loved about teaching in Jesuit schools is the many opportunities to engage with students and colleagues beyond the classroom. including on immersion trips, retreats, and study travel experiences. When Russ isn't working, he enjoys spending time with his wife, Anna, hiking America's many national and state parks, reading, playing pickleball, rooting for the indefatigable Buffalo Bills, and exploring art museums. Russ and Anna are expecting joyfully a baby boy in July. Dr. Fiorella, it's my great pleasure to turn it over to you. We look forward to it.
Thank you, Kristin, and thank you, Kristin, for the opportunity to speak about my research today. It's funny, we're on spring break right now, and I am with my mother-in-law, my wife, and her two sisters. And I can tell you that in the last 48 hours, there has been a lot of baby talk, and far less talk about the Buffalo Bills and Buffalo Sabres. But I think this is good. It's a metanoia experience for me. Let me share my. I think we're good. And in addition to saying thank you to Kristin for the opportunity to speak today, I want to start off with gratitude for the 7 individuals who spoke with me during this study, the 7 principals from Jesuit high schools that I spoke with. I think the prayer to kick things off this afternoon about listening is a skill that I developed over the course of my doctoral research the last few years. And it was a privilege to be able to sit down for an hour, hour and a half with each of those individuals and learn how to listen to them as they spoke about their experiences promoting student-centered learning, which is a very difficult thing to do, as we're going to find out today. Before I dive into the nuts and bolts of the study, I want to talk a little bit about why this study and why now. Why would I choose to study Jesuit high school principles for the promotion of student-centered learning? So what you're looking at here are 3 maps of students' journey through high school over the course of 4 years. And these maps were built by teams of teachers, either at Jesuit High School, my current school in Portland, or cohorts of teachers in the JSN or at other schools in the network. And if you zoom in closely to each of these maps, you'll notice that students' journeys are riddled with problems and challenges and perils and puzzles that they need to face on almost a daily basis. Knowing students' context and listening to teachers talk about students' context and those challenges, to be more specific, the challenges that I think are most relevant to artificial intelligence, the college admissions arms race, the youth mental health crisis, and so on and so forth, which are all visually represented here. Given all of those challenges, which are not going away tomorrow or anytime soon, it is my belief that promoting a student-centered approach to teaching and learning is key to accompanying our students in their journey towards adulthood in these complicated times. And when I'm talking about student-centered learning, I'm talking about student-centered learning in the classroom specifically, because after all, the classroom is the space where our kids are spending the lion's share of their time over the course of their 4 years in high school. And therefore, it's a very important space that we need to continue to grow and develop in. So my problem of practice is this. While updating versions of Ignatian pedagogy complemented by student-centered pedagogies is vital for teaching and learning in the Jesuit tradition now and in the future. And what I mean by that is over the course of the last 50 years, there have been various documents that have emerged from discernments that have been produced by the Society of Jesus, such as the characteristics of Jesuit education, Ignatian pedagogy, human excellence, even a living tradition from 2019, the new version of standards and benchmarks. All of these are, while they talk about the what and the how we do things in Jesuit schools, they really are theoretical in nature. So while we've updated our pedagogy, the more critical leadership challenge that lies ahead for Jesuit schools, I think, is how do we promote this Ignatian student-centered pedagogy in educators' professional learning? So in other words, how do we put those theoretical works about the what and the how we do things in Jesuit schools into practice? And I think if we were to leave this problem aside, right, and not attend to it, the risk is that our Jesuit educational mission to form men and women for and with others, men and women who see beyond themselves and are reflective and action oriented, well, we leave that mission to chance if we can't figure out how to implement those wonderful theories about student-centered learning in an Ignatian paradigm. So, given that problem, the purpose of the study is to describe and to understand the lived experience, this is of Jesuit high school principals in their promotion of student-centered learning. And the three questions that I asked principals essentially were, what does student-centered learning mean to you to begin with? And then how do you then promote, or another word for promotion is how do you educate your faculty in student-centered learning and for student-centered learning? And then what are the challenges that you face in that dimension of your leadership? So before I just started interviewing principals, I needed to gather some background knowledge about these topics. And now I'm keeping this very, very simple here. So there's a lot more to say about this, but again, just keeping it simple. Jesuit education espouses a shift from traditional teacher-centered education to something that is more student-centered, that allows students to learn on their own. So they're developing the habits and skills that allow them to go into the world and be lifelong learners. And then the other thing that I explored was principals' promotion of learning. So after teachers, principals are the next most influential position to impact students in the classroom. They have the highest concentration of leadership influence over what happens in the classroom next to teachers. In the past 20 years, principals have, their role has shifted from being merely managers. Now, given all of the learning challenges that I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, principals are called to be leaders of learning in schools. And there is a modest amount of research that shows that principals who act as learning leaders, that is, they act as the teacher of teachers, have an impact on student learning. Now, professional development, professional learning, there is a whole swath of research on those topics. So it was very difficult to narrow down what exactly was important. But the research that I engaged basically told me a few things. It told me that professional learning has a lot of pitfalls. It's very difficult. Professional learning is kind of weird, in other words. And oftentimes, you hear studies of teachers and their experience of professional learning or professional development being very, very negative. And some of those common pitfalls pertain to a lack of an ambitious vision for teaching and learning. In other words, there's a disconnection between what they're learning about in their professional development. And to keep it simple, there are some common pitfalls teachers face in their professional development, and that can include, a lack of an ambitious vision for teaching and learning that provides an anchor for their professional learning. Oftentimes, what happens is professional development can be experienced by teachers as a hodgepodge of teacher tips and tricks that oftentimes do not have a deeper impact on those teachers. Another common pitfall is that teachers often lack ownership or say in what they are learning in their professional development. The purpose of doing a literature review is to try to find a gap in that literature. And research shows, or after reviewing the literature, there's virtually no research on professional development or professional learning that promotes student-centered learning in a Jesuit high school context. So these are kind of this is the knowledge that I was holding lightly in the palm of my hand as I was proceeding with my research. So in terms of the methodology, meaning basically how does the study go? How did it happen? I engaged the JSN about candidates who would be good people to talk to about their leadership of learning. And you'll notice here that there's not a lot of demographic information in the chart in the top left part of the screen, and that's intentional because the Jesuit Schools Network is kind of a smaller place. People know people. So if I was to reveal more of the personal identities of the candidates, I may reveal something about them. I may reveal their identity. But what's important to keep in mind is that the principals that I'm talking to in this study, they have a large amount or significant amount of classroom experience, 17 and a half years on average. And the principals that I'm speaking to also had about, on average, 7 years of experience under their belt at that point. 5 of the 7 participants that I talked to had backgrounds in theology, and 5 of the 7 participants were men. The way I engaged them was primarily through semi-structured interviews, meaning that we would sit down for about an hour to an hour and 15, hour and a half, and we would have a conversation. And over the course of those 7 interviews, I developed transcripts. And then because I'm using a grounded theory analysis, and because I'm studying something that has never been researched before, I'm literally starting from the ground up. That's why we call it grounded theory. So develop the transcripts. And then as I'm cycling through those transcripts and reading through those transcripts, I'm developing codes, which are then morphing into categories, which are then morphing into a bigger category. And then ideally, you reach an emerging theory, which I'll talk about soon. So there are 3 themes that emerged from my analysis of the data, and I'll walk through these slowly. There's a lot going on in the next 3 or 4 slides, and I may neglect to talk explicitly about the different data segments that I hold from the data that I think capture the spirit of the themes. So on the right side, you've got a quip from Principal Everett, and you've also got a quip from Principal Green. I may not address those directly, but please pay attention to those as I'm going through these different sub-themes and bullet points for each theme. So when I ask principals about what they mean when they say student-centered learning, when they think about student-centered learning, they offered both philosophical and practical descriptions of what student-centered learning is. But I will add that they were also, they offered implicit and explicit descriptions of student-centered learning that was couched in Ignatian language. So what does that mean? Well, for instance, all participants talked about the importance of student context and how that informs the tactics that a teacher uses in the classroom to teach that student, right? All participants talked about how learning is essentially process-driven rather than product-oriented. And they all talked about the aim of learning being excellence, meaning that learning in a student-centered classroom is not simply to serve a student and their interests, but learning is for the application for changing the world, essentially. So yes, there were like student-centered descriptions of student-centered learning, as you see in the top right. But all participants were talking about student-centered learning within the Ignatian paradigm. Okay. So an example of a practical, when I say practical description of Ignatian pedagogy, I'm talking about, in particular, and there's a lot of things that they said, but the one that I want to highlight is they talked about teachers and students' roles in the classroom. And they also talked about how students, rather than the teacher being the one that's doing a lot of the heavy lifting in the classroom, the student is the one who is actually almost always performing, uh, executing complex performances, right? So a lot of participants talked about the spiritual exercises and the parallel between the spiritual director and the retreatant with the teacher and the student. So the spiritual director or the teacher, the student-centered teacher, is acting like a spiritual director in that their role is to design the learning experience for the retreatant or the student. They're the ones that are facilitating the reflection, and they're the ones that are coaching students so that they can transfer their learning into the real world. Whereas students in the classroom are assuming the role of an inquirer or assuming the role of a meaning maker in their reflection. And they're also assuming the role of creator, right? So that's something I think worth hanging on to as we proceed through more of the data. There were also several participants that grappled with and even wanted to kind of spar with me at times, which was fun, about what we mean by student-centered. So for example, if the teacher is still the one that's driving the learning, ought student-centered be shifted to something like, student-forward learning, or maybe we should put truth at the center of learning instead of the student. And they had a variety of philosophical reasons for that they shared. Um, I will mention too that what they did not talk about, which I was surprised by, is there was minimal discussion about project-based learning or problem-based learning or experiential learning or inquiry-based learning, different student-centered pedagogies that have emerged and are considered the prevailing student-centered pedagogies in the supermarket of education, if you will. And I'm going to come back to that as well later on. Here's another busy slide. So the second theme is that principals described a multifaceted approach to their education of teachers. So when I was trying to make sense of all of this data, and we're talking about 30, 40 minutes of conversation about this with multiple questions being asked. It took me several rounds, 4 or 5 rounds, reading through the transcripts to kind of get a handle on what was going on. So finally, I arrived at the notion that principals are describing a set of beliefs, a set of roles, and a set of practices that shape and inform their professional learning leadership. So we'll start with beliefs and then move on to roles and practices. So the Jesuit High School principal believes in the importance of teacher voice and choice and freedom in their learning. So what does that mean? What it means is that they don't believe in the common one-size-fits-all approach to educating adults. It doesn't work. There needs to be more personalization in teachers' learning. And moreover, and this is captured in the segment on the right side of the screen by Principal Willow, what many of the principals said is that they are trying to scrub away a lot of the bureaucracy that tends to gum up the processes that support teachers' learning, and scrub away the structures that perhaps get in the way of teachers focusing on learning different student-centered principles and practices that are related to their specific subject area. One of the other things principals talked about was evidence-based practices, and the importance of staying up to date with not just what evidence, what research says are best practices for the classroom, but also staying up to date with the various problems and challenges that kids face, which, as we've learned over the past 10 years, right, those things are constantly changing and evolving. One of the other beliefs that principals talked about was the importance of embedding professional development in the school, and balancing that with getting teachers off campus, not just at conferences or workshops or presentations or things that are, offered virtually, but getting teachers into other schools to allow them to see different models of student-centered learning at work, and then bringing those experiences back to their campus and trying new things. One of the things that I thought was interesting, and I think is worth adding, is that principals did not talk or minimally spoke about collegial inquiry or teacher leadership or teacher empowerment. Um, I just want everybody that's listening to hang on to those things too, because I think that there's a clue there for the insight for the study, which I'll talk about in a few slides. So the principals talked about a variety of roles that they assume when doing this work, right? So in their descriptions of their professional learning leadership, they talked about being companions who walk with their teachers. In other words, they're developing trust-based relationships with those teachers and the importance of that. Because if you don't have those trust-based relationships, it's very difficult to win teachers over as they try to shift their practice, perhaps from something that's more teacher-centered to something that's more student-centered. They also talked about assuming the role of a coach, right, who helps teachers apply their learning in the classroom or to a problem of practice in the classroom. And then principals also describe being designers of learning experiences for teachers, or overseeing the design of learning experiences for teachers. In other cases, some principals talked about acting as a dog sled leader, someone who leads from behind. And in other cases, they have to assume the role of someone, who's like driving a snowplow. Basically, they're the ones that are forging ahead with different initiatives that support the education of teachers in their school. They also talked about the necessity of being managers, managing personnel, sometimes having to be the one who delivers a firmer feedback to teachers, for example. That's very much part of the job of being the head teacher. But then there were some other roles that they talked about, that perhaps correlate more with a teacher-centered educator. So they often would talk about how they act as an inspector, or they act as a performer, or they act as an expert, sharing their knowledge, sharing about their experience. And oftentimes, we have this quip from Principal Willow here on the right side, and talking about how he has made concerted efforts to try to shove a lot of the bureaucracy, to scrub away a lot of the bureaucracy that kind of perpetuates inertia, right? Or kind of smothers teachers to a point where they don't feel like they have the freedom to try to do things outside the box. Principal Willow, in the same breath, also talked about how a lot of the initiatives, such as creating a makerspace for the school, he also talked about how those projects were really things that he took on himself rather than working with other people to try to make it more of a coordinated effort. So I think it's something to kind of keep in mind as we move forward here. And then I just want to talk briefly about the practices that they engage in, principals engage in on a daily basis. So one of the things principals talked about is that they're constantly establishing expectations for instruction. And in most cases, what they were talking about is weaving the expectations that they have for teachers, for teaching and learning into observation forms and in setting goals and addressing the faculty, and et cetera. One of the other areas, one of the other practices that they're constantly working at is in one-on-one situations in which they're having conversations with teachers about instruction. So they're sharing their expertise, they're listening, they're asking questions. Some questions that they're asking might be, what's disturbing you, or do you feel like you're free right now? How can I support you? In engaging faculty's needs. Primarily in those conversations. And they talked a lot about listening and discernment, how in those one-on-one spaces, they're doing a lot of that deep listening work that is so critical for understanding where teachers are and what they need. Principals also talked about the practice of delegating teacher education duties to their leadership teams, and that can include department chairs, academic administrators, instructional coaches, and so forth. So creating a distance between themselves and other teachers, or creating distance between themselves and professional learning leadership, but that's actually a practice that, by virtue of the way their position is structured, they have to empower other people to help them do that educating of teachers' work. And then finally, one of the practices that they are constantly working at is hiring teachers for mission and instruction. So soliciting for and selecting candidates who suit the profile of the Ignatian educator. And then finally, the third theme is all about principals being challenged by the culture of resistance. So, if you're thinking about being a leader, if you're thinking about educating teachers, whether that's, an academic, a principal, or perhaps another position in a school that is like, a principal who is a professional learning leadership, any kind of professional learning leadership position. Don't let this slide scare you, but principals were very vulnerable and open and descriptive about the massive challenges that they face in this work. And even as a listener, it was kind of hard at times to not feel discouraged a little bit when hearing what principals run up against when they're trying to educate their faculty. So, for instance, the challenges with trying to break old habits, especially with faculty who perhaps have veteran status or who have been at their schools for a long time. There's a real defensiveness that comes up because teaching is such a personal thing. There's a real defensiveness that comes up in instances when, they're just trying to ask teachers to think deeply about, or maybe deeper than how they are about their practice. Principals are constantly, fighting against success culture that sometimes can be found in our schools, right? Especially students who, are really concerned about their grades. They're really concerned about their performance. Those things impact not just students, but teachers as well. And then principals also talked about struggles with sexism and being othered. There were a few principals who arrived at schools that, they had no prior experience at. And then faculty maybe pushing back and saying, well, you're kind of new here. Maybe you need to sit back and watch how we do things here before you criticize what we're doing. And then there are some residual effects of COVID, right? Uh, you know, for many principals, there's struggles with faculty fatigue. There are too many changes that are happening all at once. So people's capacity is really there's struggles there. There's a challenge there. And then, there's a lot of deficit thinking sometimes and negativity and conflict between teachers oftentimes can be very time consuming. And it takes the place of them being able to think about in a strategic way how they teach, how they're educating teachers in their schools. Um, so that was a whole, we're kind of in the weeds right now, but when we zoom out from the data, um, my question that I'm asking everyone that's listening is the problem the solution? As I mentioned before, going through all of the data, I was a little disoriented. Um, and while I had my sets of, beliefs and roles and practices, and I could really I had a good grasp on what they meant by student-centered learning and the challenges that they face, I was still kind of puzzled by what is the insight here that ought to be uncovered from all of this data. And I think that is, uh, I came across these few quips and it started clicking with me that perhaps the problem is the solution. So I'll just kind of take you through what Willow says here in terms of modeling uh, what it means to be a student-centered a principal who promotes student-centered learning. So he says, everything I outline for you, I try to bring to my teaching of teachers to get people to see and want to innovate and do things differently than what they experienced in high school or do things differently than what they experienced in college and not just assume that the way they went through it is the best way is a widespread frustration across the entire school system, the entire education system. And Principal Juniper and Principal Andrew said similar things about modeling, right? Juniper says we want to make sure that the actual sessions or workshops or what have you use the same techniques that we've liked to see in the classroom as well. And then Andrew says the Ignatian pedagogical process that provides us a model for reflecting on our experience. So looking at these data segments got me thinking about, okay, what is actually going on underneath all of this? So this is what I'm proposing. I'm proposing that what's really happening beneath the surface is that Jesuit high school principals are promoting Ignatian student-centered learning by modeling it in their professional learning leadership, right? Their commitment to the educational mission of the Society of Jesus and to innovation both informs and guides their leadership of learning. And they talked about that in one-on-one conversations and their empowerment of leadership teams and hiring practices and the development of a culture of teacher observation. In many cases, when they were talking about their education of teachers, it sounded like I was talking to someone who, implements a project-based approach in their classroom or a discussion-based approach in their classroom or emphasizes reflection or action. But at the same time, these principles are faced with myriad forms of resistance from teachers and students. That could be competing interests, tradition, school culture. So when principals are trying to promote Ignatian student-centered learning by modeling it, on one hand, it's kind of a mixed approach. On one hand, they're promoting student-centered learning in the Ignatian tradition by assuming the roles of the designer of adult learning experiences, of the facilitators of reflection, or coaches of learning and transfer. But on the other hand, they're falling back on those teacher-centered roles, for instance, such as being a performer or being an expert or being an inspector, just as teacher-centered educators would. It's difficult to say what the results of this mixed approach is, but that needs more research. But perhaps a mixed approach is leading to mixed results. Is actually maybe perhaps not being effective against those challenges that I mentioned before. So, all this is to say that an emerging theory, I think, from the research is that we become how we learn, right? For generations, the teacher-centered way of educating has, replicated itself and perpetuated itself over the course of, generations. So if we are going to disrupt that cycle, then we need leaders who, right, educate in student-centered ways and Ignatian ways. And perhaps treating a school, right, as if it's a classroom, as if it is a place of learning in a more broader way. So with all of this said, if we become how we learn, here's what I would recommend for future research and for future professional learning leadership practice. And these are not just applied to principals. Again, you could, if you're a department chair, if you are the director of professional learning, if you're an academic VP who oversees professional development in your school, maybe give these things a thought. Um, so for future research, I think principal formation as professional learning leaders in Jesuit schools is something worth looking into. And if more specifically, how like the spiritual exercises figures into that pedagogical formation. Um, I think examining the role of teacher leadership and collaboration and processes and process-oriented models for adult learning in Jesuit schools would be something else to look into. So again, if we're trying to, for example, if the vision for a school is to be an Ignatian school that promotes inquiry-based learning or experiential learning or problem-based learning or what have you, that requires learning that is more collaborative and involves routines and processes. So how do we teach teachers to do that? Well, by doing that in their education. So some research there I think would be good. And then exploring strategies for principals to navigate the culture of resistance to pedagogical change. I think you can never look too much into that. I think that would be another area to explore. And then in terms of practices, if the principal is the head teacher, if they're the educator, the head educator, then perhaps educators need to be treated more as leaders and co-creators of a new school. Um, it seemed like in a lot of the examples that principals provided about specifically practices that they enact to promote teacher learning, it was very clear. Well, I mean, it was pretty clear that what they're trying to do is they're trying to come from the top and try to implement their approach. Um, but perhaps a more bottom-up approach is needed. So I think examining one's practice in that regard could be worthwhile. And then, considering the ambitious visions for teaching and learning, maybe going back and looking at what is our vision beyond just Ignatian pedagogy. I mentioned before that there was, when we were talking about student-centered learning, there was no mention of project-based learning or inquiry-based learning or problem-based learning. Uh, so I think in a lot of the official documents, they're talking about the IPP, but they're also talking about going to the supermarket of education and complementing the IPP with the best student-centered pedagogies of the day. So examining that critically to then inform practice, I think would be a good idea. And then addressing various forms of resistance through problem reframing and reverse problem solving. Um, I think what I was trying to articulate before when I was talking about zooming out and seeing that the problem actually could be the solution or the challenge could be actually the solution. That's essentially problem reframing. Um, so I think those are some initial things that I would recommend for professional learning practice for principals and others. But to conclude, I would just ask, how might the principalship in Jesuit schools be changed or updated so that principals can authentically model the Ignatian student-centered learning that they promote? And with that, I'll stop the share, and Kristin, you can take over.
Thank you so much, Russ. Russ, what I find to be so interesting about your research is when I listen to it as a principal, as a former principal, there's so much learning to glean. But when I also listen to it as a teacher, as a former teacher, there's so much in there as well. And one of the things that is the big connector of those two, I suppose, hats or viewpoints, mindsets, is the idea of the ownership and the empowerment that you spoke about. Can you talk just a little bit more about that? Just the value of a teacher believing that they are the leader of their classroom. That oftentimes we talk about leadership and we go right to the organizational chart and think of at the top, but the principal who is inspiring a teacher to really believe that they are the leader of their world there. How does that idea of ownership and empowerment, how does it affect learning in schools and just experience of educators in schools?
Well, I'll give you an example, or I'll
Yeah.
tell you a story. And this is a challenge that I think I've not just heard in my own context, but a challenge that I've heard other people struggling with at other schools in the network. Think about discussions about politically charged topics in the classroom, right? Um, I think sometimes there is, and this is not, I get that there are, legal implications and whatnot that leaders have to deal with. Um, Sometimes I think what happens is policies that come from the top force teachers to adapt their practice, right? So, in other words, what leaders are hoping is that policy informs practice, teaching practice. But what happens is that sometimes what teachers do then when they have those policies coming from the top down, they tend to kind of then shy away from doing anything that is student driven.
Mm,
So instead, maybe our Ignatian student-centered practice should inform our policies. And so
mhm,
that's a question that I would give you, to respond. Uh, so and I think even in my own experience, uh, there are a lot of really big problems that teachers face on a daily basis. And I didn't mention this on the second last slide, but I think if teachers are going to be isolated, and there are no structures in place for teachers to collaboratively problem solve, uh, that can make the problems that we face, the challenges, the perils, the puzzles, really overwhelming. And
mm.
again, what tends to happen, the easy thing to do is to just revert back to the teacher-centered practices,
But they know.
because it's easier. It's easier to do that.
Thank you. We've got some time for some feedback, insights from those that are joining us, questions for Rush, just even reactions as you sit with his learning. One of the great gifts of an hour like this is that we get to obviously pick Russ's brain, and he also gets to feel like the research that he has spent so much time on isn't living on a shelf. So, I'd ask for the folks that are joining us, what spoke to you from what you just heard?
I thank you. I appreciate it. Um, One thing that you spoke of was the teacher as spiritual director and students as retreatants, and I found that quite interesting. Can you give a little more information, insight into that? I have my own thoughts on it, but I'm sure given some of the interviews that you did, that would be helpful information. Thanks a lot.
Thanks for the question, Jason. Um, so I'll say what I would say about thinking about that idea of the teacher being someone who's kind of the guide on the side, as opposed to being the sage on the stage, is really about answering the question, do I want to be right all the time, or do I want to be effective? So oftentimes the relationship between the student and the world or the truth or Christ or whatever that might be, if we step in front of students and put ourselves between the student and the world, as opposed to the student having a direct encounter with that content or a direct encounter with the world or a direct encounter with Christ, um, oftentimes what happens is that the meaning making and reflection and the transfer of learning, its application into the real world, gets short-circuited. And I think that it's kind of a radical idea, but a principal who comes from the top And again, I'm not saying that the principals that I interviewed are necessarily doing this. It's an emerging theory. But if the hierarchy, right, the principals coming from the top, and trying to, you know, uh, you know, be that sage on the stage, uh, what can happen is, teachers who are the learners, their their direct encounter with their students, their direct encounter with this new way of teaching also gets short-circuited. If that's helpful.
Hey, good afternoon. Thanks for your talk, Dr. Fiorella, and hopefully I pronounced that correctly. Um, I appreciate what you said about trying to mitigate kind of the top-down structure, because often that does impede or hinder buy-in or investment from the staff often, because where is their voice being heard in creating policies, et cetera. Um, but sometimes it is a fact that like the teacher is, and I totally agree, by the way. So not as a counter argument, but just kind of clarifying. Sometimes the principal is kind of the sage on the stage. If you do have a principal who is continuing in leadership and learning and doing some of these things, because often there is a disconnect between some of the old habits that more experienced teachers may have. So how do we bridge that gap where we do want the voices from staff to be heard by the teacher, by the principal. But then if some of those habits are not the healthiest from the staff, then how do you then let the teachers lead in that way if arguably, for lack of better terms, they're incorrect, I suppose, or some of those habits may need to shift.
Dennis, I like the question. Can you give me an example of what you mean?
Oh, I have too many. um, Perhaps just perhaps teacher practice. The idea of student-centered learning, to be honest, for a teacher who's been in the classroom for decades, can be challenging, even kind of uncomfortable for certain teachers who are more used to a top-down paradigm in their classrooms. And so trying to push for new approaches to learning, more student-centered learning. And if the teachers are reluctant, though the principal may be wrong, is still, or I'm sorry, though the teacher may be wrong, it still feels that the principal is in therefore just pushing down information as that dog sled driver, I believe, right? So how then, if the principal is correct, how then is the message better received by staff? Because I do totally appreciate and support listening to teachers. So you do have more of a bottom up structure, or even more egalitarian, equitable structure, more so. Um, but then sometimes if the staff, if we're trying to break old habits, then how do we break those habits while also creating a more egalitarian structure? Hopefully that
Well, I'll say,
is clear.
yeah, I'll say two things, just two reactions. The first thing is that there are going to be people who just never change. There are people who are going to be consistently against virtually everything. We've all met those people in our schools. So that's one, factor. There's the reality. I think one of the reasons why professional learning or professional development doesn't connect with faculty, and leaders, I think, get frustrated with that, is there's a lack of a vision for what instruction actually should look like. What are our key practices? What are the principles? What are the core practices or strategic approaches to learning? If that stuff isn't articulated, not just by the principal, but that middle leadership isn't articulating that to teachers, and teachers have co-created that vision, and have bought into that vision, then I think it's very difficult for any old habits to change. And again, you've got your vision that's been co-created by teachers. I think the other thing is, are people put in spaces? Are spaces designed, experiences designed for teachers to reflect and to apply the new things that they're learning in their own classrooms. If you don't have those kinds of things, those kinds of structures in place, I think it's really difficult to break any new habits.
Cool, thank you. I appreciate your voice.
Thanks for the question, Dennis.
Russ, from all that you heard from the participants in your study, uh, for a principal to really engage in like the ideal of creating a community rooted in student-centered learning, what do they need? Like what are they missing? Did you hear from the 7 participants and their 7 different settings? Where's the gap? And for those folks that are listening that are supporting principals and ideally supporting student-centered learning, like how can we help support? What do they need if you had to boil it down to a, 30-second answer?
Time for experiences of that new way of learning, I think, is my initial reaction to your question. Because again, what Principal Willow and Juniper, and especially what Principal Willow says, which is, I think, a very profound thought. You know, teachers teach the way they were taught, and principals are going to lead the way they've seen other principals lead. So I think the question is, how do we give principals experiences of just different ways of teaching adults? If you can figure that out, then maybe new horizons or new understandings of how to shift practice of an entire faculty, maybe those things arise. But again, I really think there's something about the insight that we become how we learn. And you could even say we change based on how our leaders, lead differently. So it's a tough question. If I can't pinpoint a specific need because there are many, but I would say first and foremost, they need experiences of different ways of learning and teaching and different ways of leading.
And the kind of gift of crafting space to do it, creating time to
Yeah.
really be and embody the head teacher. I mean, I find that title even of head teacher, of leader of learning, it to be so inspiring, but really the time to be able to do that in the midst of all of their work and making that a priority
Yeah.
in some ways. So that's probably the challenge to all of us, right? The challenge to all folks that are doing the job and that are studying it, and that are supporting the folks in the roles. So thank you, Russ. Thank you for sharing your wisdom and your learning and so much more. Like all research, right? There's so much more to do, and hopefully this is the catalyst for really many valuable and important conversations that really affect the lives of kids in our classrooms around the JSN and the lives of the adults that are educating and that are leading them. So thank you.